Chapter 31 of The Money Moon. This recording is in the public domain. The Money Moon, a Romance by Geoffrey Farnell. Chapter 31, which, being the last, is very properly the longest in the book. In those benighted days when men went abroad cased in steel, and, upon very slight provocation, were wont to smite each other with axes, and clubs, to buffet and skewer each other with spears, lances, swords, and divers other barbarous engines, yet in that dark and doughty age, ignorant though they were of all those smug maxims and excellent moralities with which we are so happily blessed, even in that unhallowed day, when the solemn tread of the policeman's foot was all unknown, they had evolved for themselves a code of rules whereby to govern their life and conduct. Amongst these, it was tacitly agreed upon and understood that a spoken promise was a pledge, and held to be a very sacred thing, and he who broke faith, committed all the cardinal sins. Indeed their laws were very few, and simple, easily understood, and well calculated to govern man's conduct to his fellow. In this day of ours, ablaze with learning and culture, veneered with a fine civilization, our laws are complex beyond all knowing and expression. Man regulates his conduct to them, and is as virtuous and honest as the law compels him to be. This is the age of money, and therefore an irreverent age. It is also the age of respectability, with a very large R, and the policeman's bludgeon. But, in Arcadia, because it is an old world place where life follows an even, simple course, where money is as scarce as roguery, the old law still holds. A promise once given is a sacred obligation, and not to be set aside. Even the blackbird, who lived in the inquisitive apple tree, understood, and was aware of this. It had been born in him, and had grown with his feathers. Therefore, though, to be sure, he had spoken no promise, signed no bond, nor affixed his mark to any agreement, still he had, nevertheless, borne in mind a certain request preferred to him when the day was very young. Thus, with a constancy of purpose worthy of all imitation, he had given all his mind and thought to the composition of a song with a new theme. He had applied himself to it most industriously all day long, and now, as the sun began to set, he had at last worked it all out, every note, every quaver, and trill, and perched upon a look-out branch, he kept his bold, bright eye turned toward a certain rustic seat hard by, uttering a melodious note or two, every now and then, from pure impatience. And presently, sure enough, he spied her for whom he waited, the tall, long-limbed, supple-waisted creature, whose skin was pink and gold like the peaches and apricots in the garden, and with soft, little rings of hair that would have made such an excellent lining to a nest. From this strictly utilitarian point of view he had often admired her hair, had this blackbird fellow, as she passed to and fro among her flowers, or paused to look up at him and listen to his song, or even sometimes to speak to him in her sweet, low voice. But, to day, she seemed to have forgotten him altogether. She did not even glance his way, indeed, she walked with bent head, and seemed to keep her eyes always upon the ground. Therefore the blackbird hopped a little further along the branch, and peered over to look down at her with first one round eye, and then the other, as she sank upon the seat, near by, and leaned her head wearily against the great tree behind. And thus he saw, upon the pink and gold of her cheek, something that shone and twinkled like a drop of dew. If the blackbird wondered at this, and was inclined to be curious, he sturdily repressed the weakness, for here was the audience, seated, and waiting, all expectation for him to begin. So, without more ado, he settled himself upon the bough, lifted his head, stretched his throat, and, from his yellow bill, poured forth a flood of golden melody as he burst forth into his Song of Memory. And what a song it was! So full of passionate entreaty, of tender pleading, of haunting sweetness, that, as she listened, the bright drop quivering upon her lashes, fell, and was succeeded by another, and another, nor did she attempt to check them, or wipe them away, only she sat and listened with her heavy head pillowed against the great tree, while the blackbird, glancing down at her every now and then with critical eye to mark the effect of some particularly difficult passage, piped surely as he had never done before, until the listener's proud face sank lower and lower, and was, at last, hidden in her hands. Seeing which, the blackbird, like the true artist he was, fearing an anticlimax, very presently ended his song with a long drawn, plaintive note. But Anthea sat there with her proud head bowed low, long after he had retired for the night, and the sun went down, and the shadows came creeping stealthily about her, and the moon began to rise, big and yellow, over the upland. But Anthea still sat there with her head, once more resting wearily against King Arthur, watching the deepening shadows, until she was roused by Small Porges' hand upon hers, and his voice saying:
"Why, I do believe you're crying, Auntie Anthea, and why are you here, all alone and by yourself?" "I was listening to the blackbird, dear. I never heard him sing quite so beautifully before." "But blackbirds don't make people cry, and I know you've been crying, 'cause you sound all quivery, you know."
"Do I, Georgy?"
"Yes. Is it 'cause you feel lonely?"
"Yes, dear."
"You've cried an awful lot lately, Auntie Anthea."
"Have I, dear?"
"Yes, and it worries me, you know."
"Oh, I'm afraid I've been a great responsibility to you, Georgy dear," she said with a rueful little laugh.
"'Fraid you have, but I don't mind the 'sponsibility. I'll always take care of you, you know,"
nodded Small Porges, sitting down, the better to get his arm protectingly about her, while Anthea stooped to kiss the top of his curly head.
"I promised my Uncle Porges I'd always take care of you, and so I will."
"Yes, dear."
"Uncle Porges told me—"
"Never mind, dear, don't let's talk of him."
"Do you still hate him, then, Auntie Anthea?"
"Hush, dear, it's very wrong to hate people."
"Yes, a course it is. Then, perhaps, if you don't hate him any more, you like him a bit, just a teeny bit, you know."
"Why, there's the clock striking 8:30, Georgy."
"Yes, I hear it, but do you the teeniest bit? Oh, can't you like him just a bit, for my sake, Auntie Anthea? I'm always trying to please you, and I found you the fortune, you know, so now I want you to please me, and tell me you like him, for my sake."
"But oh, Georgy dear, you don't understand."
"'Cause you see," Small Porges continued, "after all, I found him for you, under a hedge, you know."
"Ah, why did you, Georgy dear? We were so happy before he came."
"But you couldn't have been, you know. You weren't married, even then, so you couldn't have been really happy, you know,"
said Small Porges, shaking his head. "Why, Georgy, what do you mean?"
"Well, Uncle Porges told me that nobody can live happy ever after unless they're married, first, so that was why I arranged for him to marry you, so you could both be happy, and all revelry and joy, like the fairy tale, you know."
"But, you see, we aren't in a fairy tale, dear, so I'm afraid we must make the best of things as they are." And here she sighed again, and rose. "Come, Georgy, it's much later than I thought, and quite time you were in bed, dear."
"All right, Auntie Anthea, only don't you think it's just a bit cruel to send a boy to bed so very early, and when the moon's so big, and everything looks so frightfully fine? 'Sides—"
"Well, what now?" she asked, a little wearily, as, obedient to his pleading gesture, she sat down again.
"Why, you haven't answered my question yet, you know."
"What question?" said she, not looking at him.
"'Bout my Uncle Porges."
"But, Georgy,
you do like him, just a bit, don't you? Please?"
Small Porges was standing before her as he waited for her answer, but now, seeing how she hesitated, and avoiding his eyes, he put one small hand beneath the dimple in her chin, so that she was forced to look at him.
"You do, please, don't you?"
he pleaded. Anthea hesitated, but, after all, he was gone.